let's look at the internal evidence. And I want to provide for you three key pieces. And this, we're getting right into the book of Revelation on this. Let's consider first the temple in Revelation. The first line of evidence is architectural evidence. It appears to me and to early date advocates that when John writes the book of Revelation, the Jewish temple is still standing in Jerusalem. And if that's the case, then it has to have been written before AD 70. Now listen to what John says in Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2. Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there, but leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. Well, the question arises, what temple has he been commanded to measure? Well, let's notice what temple it is. We're going to have to figure this out. This is a key issue. John receives a command, get up and go measure the temple of God. What temple is he talking about? In the first place, we've got to note that John expects the events of Revelation to occur soon. Soon. In chapter 1, verse 1, it opens with these words, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his bondservants the things which must shortly take place. This is dogmatic, it's clear, it's in his opening statement, it defines what he's doing. The events in Revelation are to occur soon. And he expects this to be understood by his original audience, because in Revelation 1:3 he says, "Blessed is he who reads, and those who hear the words," that is, hear with understanding, "who hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things written in it, for the time is at hand." So he says the events are soon, the time is at hand. I want you to hear and keep the words of the prophecy of this book. So then, the events of the prophecies of Revelation are not to be cast off into the distant future, but they're very near. Now we need to look around and find, where is there a temple of God in the year prior to 70 or around 95? Because he's commanded to measure a temple of God, and we have to say, well, if it's before 70, it's the Jewish temple. If it's in 95, what temple is he talking about? Well, there's more to this argument. Secondly, we must notice that the temple is in the holy city. Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar of God and those who worship there, but leave out the outer court, which is outside the temple. Do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, who will tread the holy city for 42 months. So this temple is in the holy city. What is this holy city? Well, the holy city, according to Scripture in Isaiah 48:2, Isaiah 52:1, Daniel 9:24, Matthew 4:5, and Daniel 27:53, is Jerusalem. John is commanded to measure a temple in a city that's called the Holy City, which must be Jerusalem. And so that temple must be the temple in Jerusalem. In fact, in Revelation 11:8, he expressly declares that it is Jerusalem he's talking about, because he says the city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, is that city where also our Lord was crucified. Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. And so we have events that are to occur soon in a holy city, and he's to measure a temple there. Well, what temple is in Jerusalem? It is the Herodian temple that we know of in the first century. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting that Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2, if you get your Bibles out and you look at Revelation 11:2 and you compare it to Luke 21:24, it is very obvious that John is picking up in Revelation 11:2 what Jesus said in Luke 21:24. Jesus in Luke 21:24 gave a prophecy regarding the coming destruction of the temple, which everybody acknowledges was referring to the temple that he was standing near, and he's referring to AD 70. Even dispensationalists say in Luke 21:24, Jesus is prophesying the destruction of the temple in AD 70. But what I'm going to do is read Revelation 11:2 and read Luke 21:24 And you'll notice a very strong parallel, and it's very obvious that John in Revelation is picking up on what Jesus said in Luke 21:24. Luke 21:24 says, in part, Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. John hears in Revelation 11:2, it is given to the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they trample underfoot for 42 months. So you have strong parallels. You've got the same city. It's either called Jerusalem or the holy city. You've got the trampling underfoot that occurs, and then you have the reference to the Gentiles. So what you have here is a very obvious allusion by John in his dramatic imagery in Revelation 11:2 back to what Jesus said in Luke 21, verse 24. Now, since dispensationalists agree that Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple in AD 70 in Luke 21, I think we can argue, well, if that's so, that's what John is speaking about here in Revelation chapter 11. Another fascinating aside in this is, in Revelation 11:2, you'll notice that he says the Gentiles will trample underfoot the holy city for 42 months. It's interesting because the Jewish war that resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple lasted 42 months. F. Bruce, in his book New Testament History, on pages 381 and 382 says, now let me tell you who the characters are. Vespasian is a Roman general who ends up becoming an emperor later, and his son Titus is another Roman general. Okay? Well, Vespasian arrived in spring of AD 67 and took charge of operations and steadily reduced Galilee, Perea. Titus began the siege of Jerusalem in April 70. By the end of August, the temple area was occupied and the holy house burned down. So when you count from spring of AD 67 up to August of AD 70, you've got a 42-month period, right at a 42-month period. And so this is a precise confirmation of the early date advocacy view. He was talking about a temple to be destroyed in Jerusalem being trampled underfoot for 42 months. And lo and behold, the Jewish temple in the first century in the holy city of Jerusalem was under siege for 42 months. And so while John wrote, the temple was still standing. Therefore, John wrote before AD 70. Secondly, the Jews in Revelation. The relationship of Christianity to Judaism also fits the temple era. Now, in Revelation 3:9, it's very clear that John is talking about something dramatic is going to happen to the Jews, and he's talking about the Jews and putting them down in a particular way that's going to help us. And let me read what he says, and then I'll explain why it's helpful. In Revelation 3:9, Jesus is speaking. You know, in the 7 letters, Jesus speaks. He says, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan, who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. I will make them come and worship before your feet. When he talks about a synagogue, he's talking about a Jewish synagogue. No other people had a synagogue. This is a famous Jewish institution. When he says they call themselves Jews, but they're not, who would call themselves a Jew but a Jew? Because the Jews were not liked by the Romans because they considered them standoffish and reclusive and all of that. And so the fact that he says it's a synagogue of Satan inhabited by people who claim to be Jews shows he's dealing with a Jewish synagogue situation. But notice what he says. When he says they claim to be Jews but they're not, he's saying they don't have the right to the name Jew. Remember, Paul calls Christians the Israel of God in Galatians 6:16. He calls Christians the true circumcision in Philippians 3:3. In Romans 2:28, he says a Jew is one who is not one outwardly, but one who is inwardly, of the heart. And thus, what we have here is a situation in which Christianity and Judaism are still mixed together, and the Christians are claiming the name Jew and saying the Jews don't have the right to that name, which is exactly what happens before 70. But in AD 70, Christianity and Judaism forever separate. In fact, by the year 80, Gamaliel II incorporated a new benediction in the Jewish benediction, and it was a curse upon the upon the Nazarene, which is the followers of Jesus of Nazareth. And so what we have in Revelation 3:9 is a clear Christian denunciation of literal Jews, saying they don't have the right to the name Jew. And that's the only period that could possibly arise in would be the period prior to AD 70, because that's the period in which Christianity and Judaism were mixed together, and they're vying for the hearts of the people and the future of Judaism, or the Jewish faith. And then finally Christianity separates, and it goes off in a different direction from Judaism altogether. Furthermore, notice what he says. I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say they're Jews and are not but lie, I will make them come and worship before your feet. In other words, they're going to come and fall before your feet. In other words, in the future, the Jews will be humbled before your feet. And what he's saying basically is, I believe, that their temple is going to be destroyed, they're going to be cast into the dust, and you will have won the victory over them. As a matter of fact, if you read the early church fathers, Ignatius, Melito, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Lactantius, and others, they constantly point back to AD 70, saying, God destroyed your temple because you destroyed your Messiah. God judged you because you killed the Christ. Over and over again in later history, the Christians are using as an apologetic the destruction of the temple, saying, God favored us over you. And so Revelation 3:9 is an evidence that in that day, Christianity and Judaism are mixed together, and yet Judaism is fast approaching a time when they will be humbled and cast down. And then thirdly and lastly, the seven kings in Revelation. In Revelation 17, we have a seven-headed beast. And it offers us strong evidence that Nero is alive. Now, Nero died in the year 68. And what I want us to note is, and the first thing we need to note is, that an angel is going to be explaining the vision to John. Now, realize that some of the visions in Revelation can be obscure. But what we have here in verses 9 and 10 is an angel coming to John to explain the situation to him. Revelation 17, 9 and 10 says this, an angel speaking. Here is the mind that has wisdom. In other words, you saw a vision, you saw a woman sitting on a seven-headed beast. I'm going to give you wisdom. Here's the mind that has the wisdom. Listen to me. What does he say? The seven heads of this beast are seven mountains on which the woman sits, and they are seven kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other's not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain a short while. Okay, so an angel says this seven-headed beast represents these 7 mountains and these 7 kings. Okay, how does that help us? Well, everybody agrees, the early day and late day advocate, everybody agrees that whoever the recipients of Revelation were, they lived during the Roman Empire in either 70 or 95 AD. And so we need to ask a question. Well, what do 7 mountains represent? Obviously, they represent the 7 hills of Rome. Even today, we're familiar with the 7 hills of Rome. In antiquity, Rome was universally famous for their 7-hilled city. So we know that he's saying something about this beast and relating him to the Roman Empire, the city located on the 7 hills of Rome. But, okay, that can work for the AD 70 date or the AD 95 date. But which date is confirmed by this? Well, notice that he says the 7 mountains represent not only the 7 heads represent not only 7 mountains, but 7 kings. These 7 kings are associated with this 7-hilled city of Rome. And what he's doing here is he's telling us about the line of emperors to his day. Notice in verse 10 he says, there are 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is, and 1 is yet to come and shall remain a short while. The 5 that are fallen are the first one, Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, and Claudius. The one who now is the 6th emperor of Rome, Nero. Nero died in 68. He's the one that now is. And then he says, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he shall remain a short while. Galba came after Nero. Nero reigned 13 and a half years. Galba reigned 6 months. The one who has not yet come shall come and remain a short while. The one who now is has to be the sixth emperor of Rome, Nero, whose predecessor is Galba, who reigns only for 6 months. And so what we have there is political evidence that Revelation was written prior to the destruction of the temple, prior to the death of Nero Caesar in 68, and therefore it's an early date argument that we have. Now, some will complain, and you may hear this if you read some of the literature or bump into a dispensationalist who's thinking through the issues. Some will say, but Tacitus tells us that Augustus is the first emperor, not Julius. You've pointed to Julius, and then Augustus, and then Tiberius. But Tacitus, the Roman historian, says Augustus Caesar founded the empire. Well, technically, the empire did start with Augustus. However, it's because of the work of Julius that it started with Augustus. And listen to this, it's very interesting. When you read Josephus, who was a first century Jewish historian, who was a witness to the destruction of the temple, he numbers the emperors beginning with Julius. He specifically calls Julius the first emperor of Rome, in which, since John is a Jewish Christian of the first century, and Josephus is a Jewish Christian of the first century, their thinking would be alike in that regard. Furthermore, Suetonius, a Roman historian, actually he's a biographer, Suetonius in the 2nd century had published a book called The Lives of the 12 Caesars. And guess where he starts? Not with Augustus, but with Julius. So he starts also with Julius. So this fits our approach to the book of Revelation. And then you've got to realize, well, what are the emperors of Rome called? They're called Caesars. Where do they get that name? From Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is the starting point for that. By the way, if you ever hear the Russian czars, czar is just a compounding of the name Caesar, which is Caesar written in Russian. Well, so in conclusion, we have looked at architectural evidence. The temple is still standing. We've looked at socio-cultural evidence. Christianity and Judaism are mixed together, and Judaism is about to collapse. And we've looked at political evidence. That is, that the reign of emperors, beginning with Julius, run up to the time of Nero, and John says the sixth one now is, and that's Nero Caesar. And so the temple standing, Christians and Jews are intermingled tensely, but nevertheless intermingled, and Nero's still alive. And so we see that the book of Revelation surely was written prior to the destruction of the temple in the year 70. And this is very important because John expects the events of Revelation to occur soon because the time is near. Revelation 1:1, Revelation 1:3, 22:6, and 22:10. These events are near. So now we've got to say, okay, if he wrote in 95 about a temple standing regarding events about to approach, what's he referring to? There's nothing there for him to be referring to. But if he wrote prior to 70 about events approaching, and he's using all of this imagery that fits right into that time frame, he's obviously talking about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70. And thus we have, I think, a compelling argument that Revelation was written in the year 70, and having that argument in hand, that opens a whole new vista on the book of Revelation, because we've got the key in the door to unlock the mysteries of Revelation, knowing when John wrote, why he wrote, and to whom he wrote, relative to the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Thanks.